that President Trump believes that a different tactic needs to be deployed here, and there's no sense in waiting, 50 days. Let's give it 10 to 12 days here to see where President Putin comes in on this. But the reality is President Putin is ramping up activity as it relates to Russian attacks, military attacks against Ukraine. And in President Trump's view, that's unacceptable. So to your point, I think he sees a different direction is needed here. These tariffs may be that case. It could be secondary tariffs and sanctions, if you will, on trading partners with Russia as well. Yes. I also think, though, that this recent trade deal between the EU and the United States, that's going to help here in terms of energy. That's going to shift the EU away from energy towards Russia and shift that energy investment towards the United States. I think it's a good thing in terms of this conflict. But look, this conflict needs to come to an end. President Trump didn't start it, but he's trying to do everything he can, particularly in his view, to end it.
We heard Donald Trump shortening the deadline for peace between Ukraine and Russia to 10 to 12 days. He had set a 50-day deadline a couple of weeks ago. He was next to Keir Starmer at his golf course in Turnberry in Scotland. President describing his last back and forth with Vladimir Putin.
All I know is we'd have a good talk, and it seemed on, let's say, 3 occasions, it seemed that we were going to have a ceasefire and maybe peace, and you divide it up and you do whatever you have to do, that obviously to get to the end. And all of a sudden, missiles are flying into Kiev and other places. And I say, what's that all about? I spoke to him 3-4 hours ago, and it looked like we were on our way. And then I'd say, forget it, and I'm not going to talk anymore. This has happened on too many occasions, and I don't like it. I don't like it.
Addressing the press team in Scotland, the President, he lectured the Prime Minister on how to win the next election.
I assume there's a thing going on between you and Nigel, and it's okay, it's 2 parties. But generally speaking, the one who cuts taxes the most, the one who gives you the lowest energy prices and the best kind of energy, the one that keeps you out of wars, he's kept you out of wars, low taxes, keep us safe, keep us out of wars, no crime, stop the crime, and in your case, a big immigration component.
Some advice then from Donald Trump. Now, John Boothman was following it all up there at the golf course and following the president. He's writing for the Times, and here he is on the line. Hello to you, John.
How are you doing, John?
Hi, John. So, look, I guess it was a curious experience watching all of this earlier on today, the Prime Minister arriving for something of an audience at the Trump-owned golf club. Tell me, what are your big takeaways from all that?
Look, the optics on this whole visit have just been absolutely incredible. This is like the most fortified village in the whole world, probably. His games of golf at the weekend have been described as the most expensive games of golf that have ever taken place because of the levels of security around about it. But the optics are fascinating. The President of the European Union Commission and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom visiting Donald Trump in his hotel, and in effect, really, subject to lectures, having to dance around the president and his utterances. This has been the Donald Trump show and will continue to be so. But the optics are very strange, the opposite, really, of what you would expect.
It is such a curious thing to see, but not an unimportant event. I mean, look, so much with Donald Trump depends on how someone gets on with him personally. How do you read the chemistry, that relationship where Keir Starmer's concerned, John?
Look, I heard somebody saying at the weekend, and I think they're right in this, that when there's been disagreements between the two, that Starmer's been very good at keeping them down to a minimum, trying not to bring them out in public so he can avoid that kind of, look, the worst embarrassment, the worst situation that happened in the Oval Office for anybody in the last 6 months was that Zelensky thing. So I think Keir Starmer's played a remarkably good game, so much so that the president's been full of praise for him and said exactly that. He's a fantastic guy. He's played a good game. He's got a good deal. And, Starmer has become that kind of bridge, I think, between Europe and the United States. And if you listen to the rhetoric today, again, as you say, on Putin and also in relation to Gaza, I think he's had some influence.
All right, John Boothman, good to have you with us. Now, let's welcome now to the programme Catherine Philp, the Times World Affairs editor. Hello to you, Catherine.
Hi, John.
I wonder what you made of it all, Catherine. I mean, this new deadline, if it was indeed a new deadline that was served on Vladimir Putin. What do you make of that?
Well, it's very interesting because what happened when Trump came out with that deadline, that 50-day deadline, he managed to knock down a proposal of legislation going through the Senate, which would have been even more punitive towards Russia, or rather Russia's trading partners who would buy its oil. So Lindsey Graham was sponsoring that legislation that would have compelled Trump to put a 500% tariff on Russian oil, on countries that bought Russian oil. So really, Trump was trying to take back the initiative there. He hates being forced into things by legislation, hates having his hand forced. So he gave this 50-day deadline. Now, everyone warned him what would happen, which is exactly what has happened, is that Russia's gone hell for leather since that deadline was announced, and seems to be doing everything it can to advance as much as it can and to wreak as much destruction as it can before that deadline kicks in on Ukraine's air defenses. No, I agree with John that that it may be that Starmer's had some influence here, but I also think that we're seeing a bit of irritation from Trump because it's not just that his conversations with Putin aren't going very far. He may have a very nice time chatting to him on the line from the Kremlin, but it's having absolutely no effect on the ground. And similarly, Trump hasn't got what he wanted out of Bibi Netanyahu either. So he's seeing these, two conflicts going on at the same time that he has staked so much political capital and credit on finishing these wars, saying that he's going to get this Nobel Peace Prize for them, and yet he's had limited success. So I think we're seeing him lashing out that. It remains to be seen whether he really will take action within 10 to 12 days rather than the 50. But he has moved, even if his motives may be quite cynical. He has moved somewhat on the issue of supplying Ukraine with what it needs, even if he wants to do so at Europe's expense rather than Washington.
Yeah. In which case, if that turns out to be the case, then this is a pretty significant moment because, he was reluctant, clearly. He sounded reluctant today. He spoke about how much he liked Russians and so on. And he kept referring to Vladimir Putin and how he had a good relation. And yet we have this now 10, 12-day deadline on the face of it, which would mean, if secondary sanctions mean what we take them to mean, it means hitting countries like China because they buy a great deal of Russian oil. Now, that would be, for Donald Trump, an extraordinary thing. It would be for the world markets an extraordinary thing.
It would be indeed. And I mean, China less so of an issue, perhaps even than India, because of China is regarded as a trade adversary, a rival and a strategic rival by Washington. And there's a great deal of, hawkishness in Washington on China that Trump has a lot of backing for, but sort of taking it out on India might be less popular. But nonetheless, that bill that was halted effectively by Trump, pledging that he would take action and giving this deadline to Russia, which he's now shortened, that bill had bipartisan support. Now, remember, the other issue that Trump has on Capitol Hill at the moment is he narrowly avoided the release of the Epstein files by having the Speaker, Mike Johnson, shut down Congress a day early and so go into summer recess early. So he has got issues and tensions with the party as a whole. And, I think this may be all part of one big issue of Trump trying to handle his party as well as his own frustrations with autocrats who aren't dancing to his tune.
Yeah, that's keeping a lot of balls in the air if he's trying to play all of those games at the same time. And India would be fascinating. But of course, last time he spoke about this, Catherine, he spoke about 100% tariffs on imports into the United States, which would mean inevitably a massive Chinese counterattack with counter tariffs, which would have a massive effect on what's on American shelves. It would mean a lot for American prices, for American shoppers.
Yeah, and John, he has gone back and forwards on tariffs. I mean, it's like he's sort of, I think in his first term, he got very keen on sanctions, and I don't know if he's sort of gone off them as a concept or whether he's decided now that tariffs just sound better. But he seems to have exchanged sanctions for tariffs, and he's used trade in some of his other supposed, peacemaking efforts. So when he apparently seemed to stop India and Pakistan dead in their tracks from escalating what looked to be a nasty conflict. Now, it hasn't resolved any of the underlying issues, but he used trade as a kind of threat against them and said, "I'll punish you in the trade sphere if you, if you don't stop now, you don't escalate." And he's boasted about that. So I think this is really his kind of new weapon, but obviously it would cause absolute chaos in global markets. Again, I think we just have to hold tight and see if if he really means it and he's really going to go through on it, because the effect could be dramatic.
Indeed, to put it mildly. Catherine, so great to talk to you. Thank you so much. Now, let's get the thoughts of Matt Terrill, who's a former chief of staff for Marco Rubio, now Secretary of State to Donald Trump, but he worked for him during his 2016 presidential campaign. Matt, welcome back to the program.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Matt, when you hear President Trump saying, as he did, that Vladimir Putin now has 10 to 12 days to come to the table to end the fighting, or there would be tough secondary sanctions levied, do you believe that?
Well, look, what I believe is that President Trump believes that a different tactic needs to be deployed here, and there's no sense in waiting 50 days. Let's give it 10 to 12 days here to see where President Putin comes in on this. But the reality is President Putin is ramping up activity as it relates to Russian attacks, military attacks against Ukraine. And in President Trump's view, that's unacceptable. So to your point, I think he sees a different direction is needed here. These tariffs may be that case. It could be secondary tariffs and sanctions, if you will, on trading partners with Russia as well. Yes. I also think, though, that this recent trade deal between the EU and the United States, that's going to help here in terms of energy. That's going to shift the EU away from energy towards Russia and shift that energy investment towards the United States. I think it's a good thing in terms of this conflict. But look, this conflict needs to come to an end. President Trump didn't start it, but he's trying to do everything he can, particularly in his view, to end it.
Yeah, I mean, the deal with the European Union may have that effect. It's a longer term effect, I guess, but within 10 days, you would then see, he spoke explicitly, didn't he, of secondary sanctions. That, if it means anything, it means China, which buys a lot of Russian oil, as well as India, which means a huge disruption to the oil market. And Catherine Philp, our World Affairs editor, was saying it would have a chaotic effect in markets. I mean, do you think the president would contemplate such a thing?
Well, I think the president views these trade deals, because it relates to the EU trade deal and energy investment, over $700 billion in EU investment will come from that trade deal into energy here in the United States. And President Trump has an America First agenda here that he's deploying. He's trying to get prices down in terms of energy, keep prices coming down in terms of energy here in the United States, but also, of course, recognizing it's a multi-pronged effort here. The president's trying to lead on domestic issues and, of course, ending these wars. And that includes the war between Russia and Ukraine. And look, the path that we're going down right now isn't working. President Putin, again, as I said, is ramping up military efforts. These sanctions, or tariffs, in other words, that could be put on Russia here going forward potentially, that could be a very powerful effect, of course, will be a powerful effect. Russia's economy is not in good shape right now. These sanctions and tariffs, if you will, could be a path forward here, but let's see what happens over the 10 to 12 days here.
Yeah, well, it could be, as Catherine was saying, dramatic. I mean, the president was also talking about how he was irritated time after time with hearing warm words from Vladimir Putin that were then followed by more brutality directed against Ukraine. The president has been played, hasn't he, by Putin again and again?
Well, I don't know about played. I think where President Trump views this is that there were multiple times where he felt that President Putin was going to come to the table and get a deal done here. And, that's on President Putin. President Trump has been trying to get the key leaders here to the negotiating table, getting President Zelensky to the table. And President Zelensky has been doing what he needs to do to get to the table. And it's on President Putin to get to the table and end this war. And
it is on Putin, but the president was also explicitly clear that he came away from a number of those conversations with the Russian leader believing that he'd made real progress, that he was within touching distance of a deal. And then away goes President Putin and does exactly the opposite. And that's pretty much the definition of being played, isn't it?
Well, I don't think it's about being played here, and I don't think it's about President at the end of the day, President Trump is trying to use negotiation to get this thing done because there's a real belief here that you're not going to end this war through a military fashion. It's going to have to happen at the negotiating table. And I still believe that you're going to have to get this war to come to an end through negotiation. And so, look, that's where this is at right now. There's a recognition that the path that we are going down right now to end this war is not working. And to the White House's credit, they're trying to change course here and make this a less of a timeline window, if you will. There's no sense in waiting for President Putin here. He's clearly, as of even last night, ramping up activity. That's not the right course. And let's see what happens over this 10 to 12-day window. But it comes down to, I believe, ultimately negotiation. You're not going to end this on the battlefield. You got to end this war at the negotiating table. And I still think that President Trump views this as an opportunity to end this war. Let's see what happens over the next few days here.
I'm Matt Terrill, former Chief of Staff to Marco Rubio. Thank you, Matt, for joining us.